the largest bonus declaration of over rupees 9,836 million.
Hello and welcome to another edition of The Hot Seat, brought to you by Sri Lanka Insurance. I'm Tracy and in the studio with me today, Chayu Damsinghe, who is the product head of Macroeconomic Research at Frontier Research, amongst other things, and who has in recent times become an absolute Twitter rock star. Chayu, thank you so much for taking this time to be with us.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, you literally have become a Twitter rock star. What has that been like?
It's not necessarily something I expected. I mean, with the crisis intensifying, we started talking a little bit about different policy measures, the different ways that I understand the economy and trying to put some additional sense into it, but it blew up far more than expected.
Yeah, I bet like your followers have increased tremendously in the last, let's say, 4 months.
Yeah, I think I started talking a little bit more after, I think, about March, where I had 13.5 podcasts.
Yeah.
That was the kind of thing that really pushed me as well, but
Yeah.
things have taken a very different turn than I expected.
Yeah. I mean, he's at Chayu Damsinghe on Twitter, and you really must follow him if you want a voice of calm. And you know, that's what has struck me the most, is that you're very, even to the haters, you're very calm, you're very sort of simple and unruffled.
Thanks. I mean,
How long has it taken to do? Is that a vignette at home? Are you just going, oh my god?
I don't know. I mean, sometimes sometimes it does get frustrating when you are dealing with things that I see as misinformation.
Yeah.
But then again, I'm also coming from the point that dealing with economics, there's no right answer necessarily. It's all a matter of perspective, what you prioritize over other things, what facts you have access to. So I mean, I try not to therefore get too invested in the
I guess it's not as personal because you're dealing with these large concepts. So I want to start off by the losses incurred by our state-owned enterprises. And there have been different reasons for why they have failed. And last week, President Macroeconomic said that there is a possibility that state-owned enterprises will be privatized. And I know he mentioned Sri Lankan Airlines, the CED, Sri Lanka Insurance, and the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation maybe as well. What's your thought on that? I mean, is privatization a good thing? Is it, at this time, is it the only way forward? Just what are your thoughts and opinions on that?
Right. So, I mean, privatization of the SOEs doesn't automatically fix their underlying problems. If the enterprise is loss-making, and for example, for CPC and CEV, you have, I think, billions of dollars worth of debt settled, then privatization is going to bring that amount of money anyway, and those institutions are still going to be dealing with that debt. So it's not a panacea to all the ills that the SOEs face necessarily.
Okay.
And especially with the kind of blanket privatization that there is some call for, I'm not necessarily convinced that it makes a lot of sense and it benefits really outweigh the cost. I think the benefits to that are not that high.
Right.
Whereas the costs of social unrest, political tensions just don't necessarily make it too much of a worthy thing to go for. But privatization on the whole, I think the short-term benefit is that it brings some sort of revenue to the government.
Right.
And for the SOE, it can be incentivized, can be the keyword, incentivize some sort of improvement. If you have different kind of management in place, it can incentivize. But as we all know, that doesn't mean all private enterprises are profit-making. There are plenty of badly run private enterprises as well in the world. So that's not an automatic fix, but it could be considered a fix towards a direction. But again, there are questions, for example, if you're talking about the CPC or the CEV, these are strategic points you need to fully privatize. Can you not instead, like the CPC, have additional players in the market? The fact that over the last few months we had LIOC working in Sri Lanka meant that a lot of Sri Lankans had fuel when CPC was unable to provide it. Exactly. So are there other things that can liberalize those markets without, where the state still has some sort of strategic input? So there are, I think, multiple aspects to that. Again, privatization is one part of the answer. It could be, especially for one that it makes no sense for the state to hold on to power. For example, hotels doesn't really make sense for state-owned hotels. Things like SLT, even the insurance corporation, you can make a case. Does the state really need it? Does it not? How can you manage those the interest, the actual strategic interest that the state might have that the private sector cannot afford, with the fact that maybe these organizations, for many of them, they are not run well. So how can you balance those two factors together?
Okay.
Privatization can be part of it. I'm not sure that the costs of massive privatization thereby make sense, especially in the current context.
Right.
But you definitely do need within the say 20 price. So regardless of whether you privatize them or not, deal with these problems.
Yes.
CEC has all these problems. CDC has these problems. Railways, authority, all of them have these problems. They do need to be dealt with. Privatization can be a part of that answer, but it's not necessarily the only answer or the right answer, the 100% correct answer. That's not necessarily something like that.
I mean, our welfare state is pretty much destroyed, wouldn't you say? And for me, the biggest concern, and we've seen that now since things went to hell in a handbasket, we've seen our welfare system just crumbling. And so it feels like it is those who are most vulnerable in our society who will have to bear the worst burden of this, man-made disaster, if we can call it that. Do you agree in the first place? And do you think it is possible to keep our welfare system going in this current economic crisis?
Right. I think the specific, I think 3 core aspects that I see in our welfare system. Actually, there are 4, but the 3 core that I think are important: health, education, and then helping the most vulnerable directly. And then we've had all sorts of different subsidies at different levels for all sorts of different products. So from energy to fertilizer. Now a lot of those are kind of getting restructured around. The problem with that time, even though yes, a lot of poor people in the country, most vulnerable, do get some benefit, is that the vast majority of that benefit actually does not go to them. It goes to those who are rich. For example, if you take just some calculation I did some time ago, before the fuel prices rose, someone who runs a diesel SUV gets about 2,000 to 3,000 rupee subsidy per week from the government, which does not make sense. Someone having the ability to run a gas-guzzling SUV doesn't mean 10,000, 12,000 rupees of subsidy per month from the government.
No.
And someone using public transport might get, as a result of the subsidy, just a little bit because it gets distributed among many people who use a bus, for example. So I think the question is, when we have a limited pot of money, how do we allocate it best? So health and education are things that have benefits beyond just those individual people who get access to health and education. It's far more for public good, and I think it's quite important that we invest more in it. Even historically, Sri Lanka has very few doctors per capita compared to lots of other countries, even compared to South Asia.
That's because they're all in other countries.
Exactly, and there's not a lot of education provided in that sense. And even in the education system, how teachers aren't really paid well, and even that it's quite important.
And that leads to a world of trouble.
Exactly, it's one of the most important jobs.
Yeah.
You need to incentivize more and more people, better people, to get into teaching. Not saying that teachers are not good, but it's that you do also have very good people who don't get into teaching simply because the pay is just unaffordable to live on.
You can't live on it.
Exactly. So you do need to fix those sides of things. In the short term, of course, the point you made is that we don't have a lot of money. The government is struggling with its revenues, especially. And how do you then take the money that you have, the limited money you have, and spend it in the correct places? And that is where some of these adjustments, even the kerosene adjustment that we just saw. I mean, you need to. I mean, there that more to do, I think, with the state-owned enterprise itself. But even things like that, is part of the restructuring of the economy. So on the welfare state, I think it's important that health and education continue and strengthen. On directly supporting the poor, I think, especially right now, because a lot of people are suffering, moving cash, especially more redistributing, moving of cash from the rich, let's say through taxation and the like, through cash transfers to the poor, is what I think makes more sense, given that we have limited resources, right? Ideally, you could argue, okay, you could give everyone a certain limited amount that will allow them to survive, so that you cover everyone, you don't miss out on anyone, but you don't have the money to do that. It's very strange. So we'll have to improve our targeting as much as possible, but we'll have to limit it to those who need it the most.
All right. I mean, did we bring it on ourselves in a sense? Like with our electricity has been extremely subsidized. Could we have afforded to do that?
So let's take electricity as an example. Now, some consumers right now and earlier pay more for their electricity than generation, now significantly more. So CEV has what we call cross subsidy, where some consumers pay more so that extra revenue can go to subsidizing the rest.
Right.
Now there's a question of whether that is the way to go, whether that the subsidy should be done separately or not, but whatever. Now the cost of electricity, and that's an important point, because very few people recognize the true cost of actually providing the electricity. So at the lower end, at one point, before the tariff increase, it's about 2.5 rupees per kilowatt hour per unit. The cost at that point, let's say a year ago, of providing that, just the generation cost was about 10 times that. Then if you include the cost of transmission, the cost of distribution, the retail sales cost, of course some of those, there's very much the question of mismanagement, especially the retail sales cost. But you're talking about something that costs, rightly or wrongly, about 50 rupees per unit. But you're giving it at about 2.5 rupees. I mean, when you increase the consumption, that the per unit number decreases just because of the arithmetic work. But you're still until you hit about that 45 unit mark, you're paying less than the actual cost of providing electricity to you. So these are things that people don't necessarily know either, and therefore it's kind of hidden from them, that information, and that information lets people believe that the lives that they're living isn't subsidized. So a lot of one thing that when I talk about the fact that a lot of our lives, middle class lives, even it's highly subsidized, people don't necessarily understand how it's subsidized. They're like, no, the government doesn't give me money, but no, the government does. Took right from the electricity bill to the fact that you save money
bus fares.
Exactly. Everything you save money on means that, for example, your extra coffee at the end of the week is subsidized by the government because you didn't pay 1,000 rupees over there. That money is now consumed more by you over here. So that consumption is very much directly subsidized. So that's the kind of thing. So yes, this is a trend that for decades we've had. The underlying numbers of these have gotten worse recently, but very much the problem has existed for decades.
On Twitter, you say that you believe an IMF bailout is the way forward, right? And you have a lot of naysayers who say it's not the way forward, or the IMF is evil. And there must be another way. But I haven't sort of seen anyone talking about what is the other way. So can you just tell me, because you said that in your tweets you said the IMF isn't evil, that they've kind of sort of started thinking more about welfare states. So can you just dispel for us who have now sort of all these questions about, well, if the IMF is evil, what does that mean? And also, if they're not evil, what are they looking for? For us to present the best version of ourselves, what are they looking for?
So it comes from 2 points there. So one is, historically, the way the IMF has looked at countries has been, deal with your macroeconomic problems, fragilities, do whatever it takes because it's worth the cost. Over the last decade or two, especially over the last decade, that narrative has shifted within the IMF. Of course, the IMF isn't a single body. It's comprised of people. As people change, their views changes. The response to what the IMF has done has changed. That has changed. To that, going at it in a no matter the cost matter, that kind of solution doesn't work. People will not accept that, and thereby the whole reform package fails. So that's one way I think the IMF has changed in that context. So the IMF isn't perfect. I mean, the global financial system, I don't think is perfect. There's more that the global financial system, the West especially, could do to help countries like Sri Lanka, the developing world, which has these debt problems. But I mean, we can't change that ourselves, right? So we'll have to work within the system that exists, and possibly as time goes on, that system will gradually change. But we can't unilaterally decide to change that.
We have no power at the moment.
Exactly. We can't say, look, we will not pay the IMF, we'll not pay all of it, we'll just do it all ourselves. That's not practical. That means you're not having food to eat, and you're not having fuel to go to work with, your lights don't work, all of that happens. So the IMF has changed in a little bit that way. But I mean, yes, so the other way is that the IMF in some countries, it's very much about expenditure. And that comes from the fact that some countries have pretty good levels of taxation. It's just that their expenditure is quite high.
Right.
So, I'll give the example of Argentina. Now, I don't have the numbers with me right now that I can recall, but Argentina's taxation levels are much better than Sri Lanka. I think more than double ours. Right. But the expenditure is incredibly high, and they have much larger public sector, and the public sector almost cordoned off so that they don't really have to deal with the consequences sometimes as well. So, you essentially have an interest group there that resists reform. And thereby you also do need to kind of deal with that massive expenditure side of things that essentially gets subsidized at multiple points across the board. So then you have to deal with that. So but the question is, how do you deal with that? You're cutting expenditure. I think even in Sri Lanka there is a call to cut expenditure. I don't think that's realistic, practical, nor necessary for Sri Lanka.
Right.
But I think what we have in Sri Lanka is more of a misallocation of expenditure. We have too much
misallocation of funds.
Yes, so we have too much expenditure going to certain areas, but not others. For example, so our total expenditure numbers are not very high. And the bottom 25% of countries in the world, in fact, is not that high.
Right.
So the question is how do we allocate that better? But for Sri Lanka, what it means is that our problem is taxation. Very, very frankly, very simply, we have to take one policy, one thing to change for Sri Lanka, it would be taxation. I wouldn't even say corruption is the number one thing, it is taxation.
Okay.
Because the moment you have better, proper, more reasonable taxation,
more realistic even.
Exactly, a lot of these things, I'm not saying corruption gets fixed, but I'm saying there's more incentive for these things to get fixed. Because you can't, what does fixed corruption mean? There's no real answer, but fixing taxation, you have specific policy measures you can do. I think that's the thing. Some of the biggest problems that we have in taxes is not just the rates. The rates did get lower in 2019 and we need to get back to there at least. There's a case to be made for increasing the progressiveness of it.
Yeah.
For example, adding wealth tax. But the thing is, a lot of these things, including wealth taxes, are administratively quite difficult. And our tax administration has not really been improved a lot for quite a while. So you need to invest more money into that. Invest more money into the Inland Revenue Department, reform customs, reform the excise department, perhaps combine different aspects of these things.
Now, I'm going to, in our final section, just talk a little bit about debt restructuring, and it's great that Chayu is here because he can explain it really, really simply. I mean, I have to say, as someone to whom it's like a foreign language, that's what I found struck me most about your tweets, is that I can actually understand it. So, essentially, we have three different kinds of lenders that we have to pay money to. So you have organizations like the Paris Club, you have countries like China, Japan, whatever, and then you have sort of private companies that buy international sovereign bonds. Am I right?
So the Paris Club is technically a group of countries. So that
right.
So I think maybe putting it as like the IMF and multilateral lenders.
Okay.
Bilateral lenders including the Paris Club, and then all the private lenders like buy bonds.
And so, do they all have to agree to the same terms?
Not the same time. So usually how it works is that multilateral creditors have, in the current economic system of the world, what we call seniority in lending. That means their debts don't get restructured.
Okay.
Now that we can argue about whether that's right or wrong or not, but that's the system that the world works in. So we can't really change that.
Okay.
How the multilaterals support the debt restructuring is that they give new financing to the country. So for example, we don't restructure the debt we have with the IMF. The IMF gives us new money. We don't restructure debt to the World Bank. The World Bank gives us new money instead.
Okay.
That's how it works. So the bilateral countries also will have to agree to some form of restructuring. It might be just 2 to 3 years of not paying debt and then starting to pay debt. It might be a small reduction in the kind of interest that you pay. That remains to be negotiated. And then you have the private creditors who will, especially in countries like Sri Lanka, where that is the majority of our debt, or at least the plurality of our debt, that will be where the biggest reductions end up happening. So again, you have a period where you don't necessarily pay the debt or pay a much reduced portion of the interest, and then you slowly start paying the debt back again until one day you come back to the point where you're properly paying all the debt. So that's the kind of way that you would reduce it. So the idea is that everyone has to be involved in some level, and they have to agree that the involvement is broadly realistic, equal. Okay. It doesn't have to be the same, but it has to be realistic.
Okay. So that indicates, a measure of transparency. And now there was an article that came out today, I think it's the Colombo Telegraph, that talks about China in particular, and it says that China will not be amenable to transparency in whatever they agree to. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm not sure about the specifics of that.
Yeah.
But what I would think is that with China, the question is that China hasn't really been involved in providing a lot of debt in this kind of bad debt environment globally before.
Okay.
So we are at a point where Sri Lanka and Zambia, Suriname, are the country that had some exposure to Chinese debt. That Chinese now have to deal with the fact that being a lender means taking these risks. So there are other countries that are distressed in the world right now that China has lent to as well, and China, I think, is struggling with the fact that they don't want, both as an organized, both as a country, but also the individual banks that have lent, don't want on their books bad loans and restructured loans and unpaid loans. So they're trying to figure out a way that they can, China would prefer for them to also have seniority in the debt, so they can also not have the debt restructured, but that's unrealistic for China to expect that compared to the rest of the world. So what that will end up meaning is that we'll have to somehow convince China at the very least for some period to what we call collect arrears and then just not take any payments and agree to that. It's not that something we do unilaterally, but which is something we have done. We've suspended payments right now because we don't have the dollars to pay.
Yeah.
But China also officially agrees to that as also for some period of time, and that might be enough for us as part of restructuring countries like China, the bilaterals. But it's very much something that we'll have to negotiate. The Chinese question in terms of debt restructuring is a significant one, and it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Chayu, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this chat with me. Do follow him on Twitter. He is a rock star. It's at Chayu Damsinghe. And until next time, this is Tracy Singer for Light 87. Thank you for joining us on the Hot Seat, brought to you by Sri Lanka Insurance.
The largest bonus declaration of over rupees 9,836 million.